All right, welcome everyone to the Institute for Public Knowledge. My name is Eric Kleinberg. I am the director of the IPK, professor of sociology as well here. For those of you who are new to IPK, we are a university-wide institute bringing together people, scholars, students, staff from various parts of the university, and also make a point of bringing people from outside the university in. We like to be kind of site for engagement between the university and the many communities we are embedded in. We do a lot of big original research projects. We have a lot of working groups of faculty and students, and we like to do a lot of open public conversations about things that we think we should all be discussing. And when we found out that Julian Zelizer had a new book out about partisanship, we did everything we could to get to the front of the line to get him here. We're really excited for this conversation tonight. The format is we have an interview conversation for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. A really nice thing about the Institute for Public Knowledge, for those of you who are new here, is that all of our programming is free, unless you're an NYU student, in which case we charge $100,000 for it. It's really just $90,000. We do ask that when we have authors coming to talk about their book, you make it easier for the bookseller that comes all this way with a big box, and just do what you can to make the box of books a lot lighter. At the end of the night, we even like it if they don't have to bring home the box with them. And Julie would be really happy to sign copies of the book. So, theme of the night, In Defense of Partisanship. Feels like we're in a moment when it's hard to defend just about anything that got us to where we are today in the United States. There are other nations on earth that have more than two political parties and don't find themselves in exactly the predicament we're in. And so one might wonder, like, is there something else we could do that could keep us from being in this situation here? How did we get here? What comes next? Those are some of the more current questions, but Julian, as many of you know, is a historian, and so he'll come at those and other questions from a different angle. He is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, also a CNN political analyst and a contributor to NPR's Here and Now. He is the author and editor of, the author of 27 books now, and he's only 28 years old. His most recent books are Myth America and Burning Down the House. He lives in New York City. Julian, it's really nice to have you back at IPK.
Great to be here.
Then we have my fellow countryman from the north side of Chicago, Jonathan Alter, who is an award-winning author, political analyst, documentary filmmaker, columnist, television producer, and radio host. His most recent book, which is newly released, is American Reckoning: Inside Trump's Trial and My Own, and you could add to that all of our own at this point, and for what. He's also the author of his very best, Jimmy Carter: A Life, The Center Holds, Obama and His Enemies, The Promise, President Obama, Year One, and The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. A former senior editor and columnist at Newsweek, Alter is a longtime analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, and in 2021 he launched a Substack newsletter called Old Goods. Jonathan, we're really happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
They're going to have a little discussion, and then we're all going to jump in, and please join me in welcoming Jonathan.
Thank you. All right, so we meet at a critical juncture. Just today I read former Labor Secretary Robert Reich wrote that a coup is underway and we're amid a constitutional crisis right now. Do you agree with that?
We could be heading there. This is probably the most aggressive exertion of presidential power, or attempted exertion, since the Nixon years. And it's not simply trying to do a lot and trying to do things that are controversial. I think there's a clear intent to circumvent law, including the Impoundment Act of 1974 as an example, to test the limits of how far a president can go. This time, the president has the full support of his party. And so you combine those two, that can bring you into certainly can bring you into a crisis. I don't know if we're there yet, but you want to know before you get there.
What is the red line in your mind where we know we're in a constitutional crisis?
Well, one is if a president is circumventing clear law and nothing happens. There's no pushback, there's no consequence, there's no accountability. So, for example, if President Trump is able to impound money for entire programs, which violates the 1974 law, and nothing happens, to me, that's entering into crisis mode. If the court makes a decision on any of these issues like birthright citizenship or some of the other questions that are now tied up in the court, and he doesn't care, and he moves forward with trying to do whatever he wants to do, that's a constitutional crisis. So, part of the crisis is the exertion of power in abusive ways. The second, though, is there a response that can check that?
Well, there were several members of the House who stood outside the U.S. Agency for International Development, and they were barred entry, although they are members of the oversight committee on that agency. And a couple of them compared it to Putin's Russia, where, in this case you have a group of, it's astonishing.
Like Congressman Raskin you're talking about.
Yes, Congresswoman Crockett and some others. And you have a group of six people between ages 19 and 23 who have seized control of the computers at the Treasury Department, which have private information about 2 million federal employees. And in the meantime, they've frozen spending and activity by AID all over the world. So literally, kids in Africa, this sounds like something your parents told you when they wanted you to eat your peas. They're literally starving tonight because these programs that they depend on have been frozen.
Yeah.
So the wheels of justice turn slowly. It could be a while before the courts grant an injunction or otherwise weigh in on this. So what do you think I always hate it, I know you do too, when we're asked for predictions, but I'm going to do it anyway. Where do you think this is going in the next week or two?
I don't know. You're a journalist, I'm a historian, so I can always just punt and say, well, I'll tell you what happened right up to today. Look, my instinct is it only gets worse. I am not one who believes in turning points with this president or the party, frankly, and that's a place I think I might differ with some people, but I do believe the party is fully behind him. So if you have that combination, I don't think he's going to get tired. I don't think he might move and shift what he wants to do and try to kind of focus on another area. But some of the objectives are very clear. Look, the objectives of rolling back immigration, cutting down the government in very substantial ways, eroding kind of any barriers on his power for the next 4 years, and some amalgam of policies overseas that are kind of combination of territorial expansion and pulling out of or weakening ties to liberal alliances that have been in place since World War II are all very clear and more. And I don't think he's going to stop. I don't think he's going to get tired. I don't think he will get frustrated. And I don't think, as we just saw with all the confirmations, that the party has any real interest in moving away from him. The only time we have seen this so far, if news reports are correct, is Republican senators who were upset when they learned what the spending freeze was going to mean for their constituencies. But other than that, it's a pretty strong push that's going on.
But you do see some pushback. So the 350,000 Venezuelans in Florida they're here with documents.
Yep.
And they were told before the election that they would be protected. They now feel, quote, betrayed by Donald Trump, who most of them voted for. You're starting to see some stirring on the Hill. Senator Schatt of Hawaii is putting a hold on nominations. Why do you think that the Democrats have not moved more quickly to use some of the tactics that, say, Mitch McConnell used when the Democrats were in control?
That's a good question. I think the kind of mobilization, I'll come back to your question of why, of the Democratic Party in the House and Senate will be vital. I mean, I do think even though they are the minority, that is going to be one of the principal barriers potentially to the administration. I think part of it is a kind of shock and awe feeling by the party. I do think a lot of Democrats were thrown by the entire election process, from Biden and his withdrawing to the outcome and what happens. I think the party, look, the Democrats, and we can talk about this, are simply more reluctant often to deploy hardball tactics than Republicans are, such as Senator McConnell. So I think it's taking them a little time to see that they are in fact going to have to be part of the front line, and to see the tools. There's many tools they have available, especially given the slim majority that Republicans have, to cause problems for the administration. So the delay, I don't know why there was a delay. Those are two reasons, but I do think that's changing, in addition to kind of examples of what you're talking about, which always happens. You know, when you want to cut government in the abstract, it's very popular. When you start to cut benefits, services, and more, in reality, you start to mobilize opposition. So I think those two things have happened in the last few days. And if you have skillful leadership, a kind of former Speaker Pelosi-style leadership among Democrats, I think they can do more than some think is possible.
Trump is less popular at this time in his presidency than any president in American history, with one exception. Trump was first Trump. So at this point, you know, Jimmy Carter,
Yeah.
you studied, you wrote a book about him also. He was at close to 70%. Trump, as usual, is below 50. And isn't it a little bit like a new car that you drive off the lot? I mean, he really only has no place to go but down in his popularity as more people react against some of these radical things that he's trying to do, right?
Maybe. I mean, he is a president who governs without being liked. And I think he's disconnected approval from strength, from political strength. I think his strength derives not from the fact people like him, but the Republicans, from voters to the party, see him as useful in terms of maintaining power, or they're scared of his electorate. One of the two. But I think he doesn't care about being loved by lots of people. And I think his tactic is to make you hate the other person. That's what he does in campaigns, that's what he does with his opponents, that's what he did with the media. I think there's an awareness that he has exactly what you're saying. So I'm not sure in our current electoral environment it's different than 1977 and 78, given how polarized it is. If you're dealing with 50-50, you don't have to have strong approval ratings, you can still be effective.
So he's using what Steve Bannon calls muzzle velocity, as Rick Klein described it in a good piece. But to what should we attribute the level of fear? And since you are really, and one of the great things about this book is the history. And so I guess the question that comes to mind is, have we seen another situation where members of Congress are as afraid of the president as they are today?
Afraid or united behind, whatever your perspective.
Well, in private, they all despise him. But they fear him. They fear they won't get reelected if they cross him.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't had a president with this kind of hold on the party for a while. I mean, Biden did not have that kind of loyalty/fear. Trump in his first term had some of it, but it took some time to build. And Obama, I don't think, had that either. He had admiration, and he did have strong party support, but not this kind of fear of crossing a president on almost anything. So it's even, look, go back, we started with Nixon. there were more Republicans who were willing to challenge him or to question him. This is a pretty unique situation. And in part, it's not about Trump just. It's about, again, we are in an era, to understand the Congress part, we've been in the era since the 90s of unstable majorities. I think that's a fundamental of Congress. Neither party controls Congress for a long period of time anymore, as it existed from the 1930s to the 70s, when Democrats controlled Congress, to the 90s, almost the entire period with a few blips. Now control flips back and forth, and the size of majorities are very slim, like today. House Republicans can't afford to lose many members for any reason. And so when you're in that kind of environment, what we know is parties are very reluctant to give anything or to do anything that can hurt them in the next election cycle. And I think for a lot of them, the idea of crossing President Trump, even those who are pretty loyal to most of what he wants to do, it's a great risk. They rather risk surviving the controversy and keeping their power than crossing him and losing their own seats or possibly endangering their majority.
I mean,
in the House and
what
Senate.
power do they have? He didn't mention any legislation in his inaugural address.
It's
And
coming.
he's governing through executive order. So where, you know, are they going to be able to really challenge Russell vote and Project 2025 specifics that are coming out of the Office of Management and Budget? What power does Congress have of any kind right now?
Well, first, I'll come back. I don't think they want to. I mean, there's just not, I don't see where the great resistance is. On the first executive order rounds, it was Republican pushback from the Senate that somehow got in his ear when he rescinded that order. It wasn't simply the constituents. It was constituents in red states who were learning what was going to happen. And it was Republican senators, by reports, that informally had some sway. I don't know behind the room what that entailed, but someone was listening. There is legislation about to come. It's going to be a big reconciliation, but big and beautiful, as the president says, but that's significant. That is how presidents govern now. So we shouldn't think, oh, it's just one bill. That's a mistake. That is exactly how most of our initiatives happen. And that's going to include many things, from trying to sustain the tax cuts from his first term to, I'm sure, more immigration issues. As much as they can tie to the budget, they will squeeze in there. And he does need their support on this. And I don't think it's irrelevant to him. I'm not one who says he doesn't want legislation. I'm not sure he always has the stomach for what it takes, but he wants big bills. And so that's coming. And there they have some leverage as well. Obviously, if they really wanted, Senate Republicans have the leverage of hearings, they have the leverage of oversight, but that all assumes there's big differences between them. I think really what's going to happen is they're going to sustain what he wants, and a lot of what he wants is what the party for at least 2 decades has been fighting for.
But he only has, in the Senate, which is the easiest place to block it, he only has 4 votes.
Except for reconciliation, so as long as
That's
it's,
what I'm saying,
yeah,
even with reconciliation,
you can only lose a few people.
yeah.
But the Senate, the test
Numbers 4.
one suggests he might be able to do that, because in these, so far, other than one extreme example of a nominee who was disqualified, Matt Gaetz, that's where the bar is at this point. Everyone else is getting through, it looks like. And, you know, Senator Cassidy voted for RFK despite all that protest as being a physician. So I think that's like a first test. He's testing the waters, and I think, you know, I'm not sure he can't sustain 51 votes.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder whether legislation is quite different historically than it has been in cabinet appointments. So you can have, you know, Lisa Murkowski and 3 or 4 of her colleagues who say, you know what, we don't want you to kill the Agency for International Development, and that won't be in the bill, right? And they need her vote. So there will there be somewhat familiar bargaining over the reconciliation bill this winter?
Well, the bargaining is going to take place between the House and Senate, and there's some fault lines within the Republican Party that they will have to deal with.
In the House Senate?
Yeah, so it's not just with the administration.
In the House Senate Conference
Yes,
Committee,
exactly.
when they resolve the differences.
Part of this, John, though, is about the Democrats, and I think, there's two paths that we've seen. There's the Senator Fetterman path, who's been pretty eager to try to find common ground, and there is the Schatz, maybe Raskin path of kind of Pelosi-like response, meaning keep the party united in a no position and use the tools that are available to the Democrats to try to slow him down and to cause fractures. If Democrats are united, those little margins get more perilous because then you need every Republican. And so part of this depends on how effective Democrats are as a partisan opposition. And I don't know the answer, but I think that's going to be really important, even though they're the minority party.
Okay, so in the book, you argue for partisanship. Why?
Oh, sorry, it's just going to take a while. Well, I do two things. I mean, one thing I'm trying to do in this book is to just answer a very basic question of, even though the founders, many of the founders, like James Madison, were terrified of division in this country and wanted to create this whole constitution that prevented parties, from day one, literally, parties are forming, including James Madison, and that our history, even though partisanship is as hated as almost anything in American politics, has been fundamental to how we operate. Parties have been responsible for some of the biggest moments of generating ideas, whether it was the Democrats and FDR in the 1930s, or Ronald Reagan and Republicans in the 1980s. Parties have been the connective tissue between the different branches of government, this disjointed, messy system we have. Parties have been kind of a key thread. And today, and all the way back, parties are the way we handle our discontent in the political system as opposed to outside it. So part of what I want to argue is there's a reason that parties have been vital to this country. And I think they still have a very important function. Beyond an immediate argument that Democrats should be pretty partisan right now if they're going to stop some of what President Trump is trying to do. The second part is the partisanship we see today is not the only kind of partisanship that has to exist. And I try to write a history of Republican politics since the 80s, which has created a hyper-partisanship without guardrails, which I do argue is destructive. And we have to separate that from the idea that parties altogether are not good for the country. And there's a realistic argument. I think this is still the best and most realistic path of what we're going to have, so let's focus on fixing parties rather than kind of imagining a different world.
So you have this phrase, responsible partisanship. What does that entail?
Responsible partisanship is simple for me, but it's important. It's a partisanship with guardrails. I mean, I think of politics of having, if you're an elected official, you have three things you focus on historically. One is party power. You want your party to be in power so you can do what you want. A second is governing, and you think about how do you govern even while trying to push for power. And third, it's the health of our democratic institutions, that our elections work, that our Congress and presidency are healthy. And I try to trace the history of the GOP from Newt Gingrich through Trump, where I think they have abandoned two of those pillars almost altogether, where the partisan imperative is everything. And that's a partisanship where any process can be weaponized. I don't think there's a sense some things are off the table. Any rhetoric is permissible. And the scale and scope of what you could do to keep power is unbound. That's not responsible partisanship. A party, I think of Speaker Pelosi, and this is not a partisan argument, as a kind of example of responsible partisanship. Very tough, very firm in centralizing her party and keeping people in line. She punished Democrats who tried to defect from what she wanted and rewarded those who didn't. She used all the tools available, legitimate tools, to stop Republicans, but she had limits on what she was going to do. She wasn't going to challenge the election system. She wasn't going to kind of threaten to throw the country into default to prove a point on a spending. And there were those kind of limitations, which for me is how you have a responsible partisanship. Tough parties with boundaries and guardrails.
So Democrats did use the debt limit, but you're saying they didn't go right up to the cliff. They would stop. They'd sort of brandish it, but then they wouldn't go as far as the Republicans?
So when Democrats have threatened not to raise the debt limit, there's a few examples. It was purely symbolic. It was a few members of the Democratic Party kind of making a point about some spending initiative that they were against or a budget they were against, knowing all the votes were in place to pass it. In 2011, something different happened. There was a real risk that this was not going to pass. And I think a lot of Republicans, from what we've learned, were all on board for not doing that. Again in 2013, and several times since then, Republican Congresses have played around with this in a serious way. That's very different than what we have seen until this point. I don't know if that's going to change, but until this point, there's been a difference in how the parties handle it. And an interesting little historical nugget, one of the times we actually we don't raise the debt. The debt ceiling, for anyone who doesn't know, it's just basically Congress is agreeing to spend what they've already agreed to spend. So they're paying for what they said they were going to pay for, and if you don't do it, you send the country into default. In 1979, we go over the debt. We don't raise the debt limit in time, and it's a timing. It's not a grandstanding thing. They're debating something, and they go over the time limit. They quickly correct it, and there's something passed called the Gephardt rule, named after Richard Gephardt, which essentially is a rule that ensures this will never happen, that automatically you'll have a debt ceiling raised so the country doesn't have to worry about going into a catastrophic moment. And one of the first things Speaker Gingrich does in 94 or 95 is to get rid of that rule, and has put us in a path where we are today.
So we're going to get back to Gingrich, but I want to actually start with earlier, because one of the great things about this book is you really get a sense of the history of Congress, which we don't read about nearly enough. So Woodrow Wilson, he was both the scholar of Congress at Princeton, where you teach, and also could put his ideas into practice as president. He thought that Congress was too powerful, right? What was his analysis, and how did his presidency change the balance between the branches?
Yeah, so I have a whole chapter in this book that's basically about the history of people supporting partisanship. And there's a long history of it that we forget. People who wrote about this, who tried to practice it. So the first is Woodrow Wilson. He publishes a book in 1885 called Congressional Government. He's a political scientist at Bryn Mawr before Princeton, before being president. And he basically is enamored with the parliamentary system of England. And he argues that we have this disjointed kind of system where you have all these committee leaders in Congress who each have their own power, lots of little legislators, lots of little fiefdoms. And so presidents couldn't get what they wanted, because if you pushed something with your own party in Congress, there was no there, because you had fragmented power through Capitol Hill. And initially, early in his career, he wants strong parties where the party in Congress and the party in the White House are connected, and they can push through agendas, and they can kind of hold legislators' feet to the fire if they're not going to go along with the party. Gradually, he starts to argue the president should be the head of the party.
So he would approve of Trump, probably.
It's a good question. It's a fair question. I have a line, I wrote an op-ed at the Times about this, and I had a line that got struck by the editor where I did say there's a little Woodrow Wilson in Donald Trump, because when Wilson is president, actually, he does try to govern that way. He works really closely with the Democratic Congress. He makes sure committee leaders like this guy Claude Kitchen of the Ways and Means Committee are working in concert with him. And that's how a lot of the legislation actually happened.
Big legislation in 1913, the first federal income tax, unless you count temporary one during the Civil War, the creation of the Federal Reserve system, a whole slew of other.
So he tries to practice it. And I mean, the problem is, he's the president in the progressive era in America, and that's the period we start to move in the other direction. So in the there's a period where partisanship gains strength after he writes this book, in the 1880s, 1890s, and then in the early part of the 20th century, parties start to weaken. You have reforms that are passed, from civil service reforms to the secret ballot, that weaken the power of parties. You have more agencies and nonpartisan commissions. And then in Congress, by the 1930s, committees are back in power fully and independent not only of the president, but committee leaders don't even listen to the party leaders. Each committee leader has their own fiefdom.
And that goes to the 1980s.
And that goes all the way to
the old bulls, they call them. But just to
Yeah.
focus for a second on the turn of the last century, so you have the establishment of the civil service in 1883, which is kind of a reaction against Andrew Jackson's spoils system, and a professionalization of government. Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, strong supporters of civil service. It strengthened again in 1978 under Jimmy Carter. Is it in danger of all coming tumbling down now? Are we in real danger if the Supreme Court upholds Schedule F and some of these other things that Trump is trying to do to politicize civil service? Do you think we could be living in a really different world where we have a federal government made up of loyalists and political hacks? Or is that just, as frightened as a lot of people are right now, is that just not going to happen? That's too big of a change.
I mean, ask the people at USAID what they think, and they'd say, no, this is worrisome. I think that's an example of hyper-partisanship, where it's not about just strong parties fighting over policy, fighting over ideas. It's strong parties maintaining total control over everything. And there is a purge that's taking place. I don't think that's a kind of hysterical word to use. I don't think it's an exaggeration. I think Elon Musk has been an important part of this, and what they're trying to do from this Schedule F, which just sounds like a technical term, but what they really want to do is have a very strong hold on the federal workforce. And it's not simply controlling who's competent and who's not competent. From what we've heard and what we've seen, it's about who's loyal. And the loyalty to party and to president will be paramount. And that undermines kind of the agencies you want to be outside of this partisan world.
Explain what Schedule F is, because it's something the Supreme Court will probably...
Look, it comes down to kind of how much control the executive branch has over employment and over civil service protections. And the whole goal of this is to erode the protections that go back to the 1880s. So it's easy to remove and put into, it's harder to put new people into place, but it's to get that kind of leverage.
But when this, when we get past shock and awe and all of this is being litigated, the government employees unions have over the years enacted a whole series of due process provisions. I used to work for a little magazine, wonderful little magazine called the Washington Monthly, that covered the bureaucracy, among other things. It still does, really very, very well. And they had a headline once, "Firing the federal employee, the impossible dream." And there are all these protections.
Yeah.
And the courts could get rid of one level, but then there would be 3 or 4 other due process protections that the unions have been able to get codified over the years. So is that part of the story maybe being undercovered, that this, just because Trump has issued these executive orders doesn't mean that they'll necessarily stand scrutiny?
They might not, but there's other ways in which we've seen the biggest period of shrinking government. There's 2 periods. One is the 90s, actually. President Clinton was most successful in shrinking it by, I think, several 100,000 people, but it's through buyouts, it's through incentives, and it was this whole efficiency project. Other efforts have been less successful, but the 2 things that I think are very possible, even with those protections, should they survive. One is just it's making work uncomfortable and difficult. That you can do within the existing structure. So that was part of why one of the first orders was a back to work instruction, loyalty.
Back to work from virtual to
from virtual. Loyalty measures can create a very intimidating workplace. The second thing we've seen, which is interesting, the big reason the workforce today, the federal workforce is actually not much bigger than it was like 50 years ago, despite growth in population size. Part of what's happened is contracting out a lot of government work, and that's also an option. And I'm watching Elon Musk, I'm waiting for that shoe to drop, kind of the idea of simply moving certain parts of government into the private sector.
Well, they want to privatize NOAA, which does all this weather forecasting for the government.
Right.
And they want, this is where corruption comes in. They try to do this, Michael Lewis wrote a book about it, Fifth Risk. They try to do this in their first term, privatize it, give it to their friends so that they can sell it to farmers and others who very much depend on this weather forecasting. So there's, some of this is going to be almost breathtakingly corrupt, right? Isn't that where a lot of it's going?
It could. I mean, that's the reason. I mean, we bash. There's so much bashing of federal workers. We forget why we depend on them. And there's different. I mean, part of what federal workers do who are protected is prevent corruption, because they're under the auspices of the government and often less likely to engage in this kind of corrupt behavior, or even able to, as a private sector firm. We saw this with Iraq and contracting and all the problems that came up with contracting, where there's no oversight, there's no real monitoring. Another thing
Or
is,
Elon Musk in control of NASA.
federal workers
Control
provide,
the IRS.
right.
The conflicts almost right themselves.
And federal workers also kind of provide a level of expertise in government, in administration, because they've been there for a long time, that you're not going to have. So there's a lot of risk in what's going on.
Let's go back to Gingrich, because I want to kind of get this, give people a sense of how Gingrich changed the game. You wrote a book about him. And so he would use words, he would tell other Republicans that they had been too polite for generations. And they had to use words like treasonous, sick, pathetic, to begin to employ a whole different kind of smash mouth politics. So how did that change the game?
It was very important. I mean, he starts doing this in the 80s, before he's speaker, and it's in part rhetoric, and this is not subtle. He literally sends out a memo saying, kind of use much more aggressive language. He's also much more interested in weaponizing every element of politics, from television in Congress to the budget process, which is one of the first things he does as speaker. He sees the value in shutting down the government, not just seeing it as a problem. And the key with Gingrich is you've always had legislators like that, meaning who are very out there, but he becomes part of the leadership. So in 1989, when he helps bring down Speaker Jim Wright, he becomes the House Minority Whip. 94, he becomes the Speaker, and he elevates these ideas. He doesn't change. It's a little like Trump. There's no turning point. He institutionalizes this very, pretty ruthless approach to partisanship at the highest levels of power. And he's not, he writes about, there's memos in his archives which are pretty interesting, where he's saying, stop worrying about civility, stop worrying about bipartisanship. We need to obtain power and to keep it. And so by the time he's speaker, he is kind of leading a whole new generation of Republicans who are proponents of this kind of hyper-partisanship, which I think leads us exactly to where we are today. Many of his cohort go into the Senate, many stay in the House for many years. Trump himself, I think, is kind of very aware and directly talked to Gingrich a lot. So Gingrich is one person, he's not the only person, but he was a key pivotal figure in that 80s, 90s who changed the direction of the party.
If you lay on top of that algorithms that, work for controversy and outrage, you're to a point where today Musk tweeted that a congressman was a dick.
And I didn't see that one.
It's not even,
Missed it.
it's not even,
Right.
nobody says anything. He's a private citizen exercising immense power. Congressman wants to hold a hearing where he asks him some questions. Musk calls him a dick. So we've gotten to this, pass that is, I think for a lot of people, pretty alarming. And you have a series of reforms that are not directed against what's going on now, because you wrote the book before you knew what the outcome of the election was. But take us through some of these reforms. They might sound technical or in the realm of, wonky political scientists, but they all have real world significance. And so I'm going to just list some of them and then tell us how they were,
Sure.
if these reforms were implemented, all of our lives might be better. So the first one is returning to regular order. What does that mean?
That means that you have a pretty stable process of legislating. And there is a process that is followed where members, rank and file members, committee leaders still working in concert with the party leadership can rely when decisions are made on a pretty standard process as opposed to what we have today, which is a total top-down without any kind of order, without any kind of regularity. And there's bipartisan support, ironically, for this. And it goes a little against partisanship, but the argument is if people feel bought in and they buy into what the party leadership is doing, you ultimately have a healthier kind of partisanship than something that's just being run by a few people.
So
regular
more-
order is just it's a system of decision making.
More power for committees to hold hearings,
To hold hearings, to
the
mark
bills,
up bills, more regularity in what rank and file members can do.
allow
And,
amendments
yeah.
on the floor, return floor debates to
Yeah.
some consequence, which they have no relevance.
So it sounds
in.
technical, but for many members, this is a great source of frustration where it increases the heat in Capitol Hill because they feel that they're not really part of it.
Okay, so you already talked about the debt ceiling, and clearly you're for eliminating that and going back to the.
That's a big reform. It's a part of the section. I have a whole section on weapons of mass destruction where I think we need to remove some of these procedures that have become so dangerous. And as they become part of the partisan battles, lead the whole country rather than just the parties into these perilous situations. The debt ceiling is not part of the Constitution. There's no reason we didn't have it for a lot of American history. And I think we've hit a point where we need to take that tool away from the parties and have a different kind of process. And there's all kinds of reforms people propose.
Is there another weapon of mass destruction that maybe doesn't get as much attention?
Yeah, I mean, the one I talk about, which is, this is not written for the day, so some of them won't be popular. I think the filibuster has actually been a source of partisan obstruction rather than a great deliberative tool. And I think the way we have seen this thing used since the 1970s has allowed the minority party to just cause a situation where you need 60 votes on everything. And that is not functional in this day and age. So some people want to eliminate the filibuster, but certainly you can lower the threshold for ending one. That is not hard to do. We've seen the filibuster eliminated for some areas already. We've had a whole history of reforming this, and I think that's actually important. And then campaign finance is another area to talk about.
So this is one of those where, one's view of the filibuster depends on what happens in elections. So I was with you before the election. Now I'm thinking, if there wasn't a filibuster, they would be enacting a huge structural change not just getting rid of the Department of Education and FEMA and a whole series of other things that we can't even contemplate, that the only thing that is standing between us and radical change, buying Greenland or whatever, is the filibuster.
Oh, and first of all, this is part of why we do so much with executive action. And so the way the Congress is structured actually prevents or has a disincentive for legislative battling it out on Capitol Hill. And so doing it for executive power, in my mind, even though it's tenuous and temporary, is pretty dangerous. And I don't write this book for the moment. I mean, I really wanted to write a book that was short and accessible, but big picture, and thinking about the health of the system as opposed to where we are in any given year. And look, studying Congress as it's unfolded since the 70s, it's hard to make an argument in my mind that having a 60-vote threshold in the Senate really makes sense. Because yes, you're right where we are today, but on the other hand, there are so many measures. We would have a better immigration system right now had the 60-vote threshold not existed. We had George W. Bush, a Republican, and Barack Obama trying to push some rational process for a path to citizenship that has fallen off the table and leads us to where we are today. Climate change is kind of a high cost we've paid not to be able to get robust measures because of the 60-vote threshold, and I can go over issue and issue, even voting rights. So yes, a filibuster is a barrier, but so are robust voting rights, and the cost has been incredibly high to the way we govern. So again, I'm disconnecting the recommendations from the moment, but I think these are the kinds of reforms that will remove tactics that have become just way too destructive.
Do you think there's any danger that John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, will blow up the filibuster right now?
I don't know. He hasn't given any indication he wants to do that. And I do think he wants to position himself as, even in this era, still being the institutionalist of the moment, and that's how institutionalists define themselves.
And they know that the shoe can be on the other foot.
Look, Harry Reid was also like that until he wasn't.
Yeah.
So people can flip, and it will depend how this goes.
All right, so you have some campaign finance reform ideas. Which are the most important?
Well, look, the idea of having big money out of politics, I think, is very difficult at this point. So public finance ideas, I think, are very good, but I don't think they're going to happen. I think the most exciting area of campaign finance reform is encouraging small donations. And many states and cities have been experimenting with incentives to get people to donate $5, $10. And that doesn't get rid of money in politics. But I think inherently, if you have people giving small donations in mass, that's better for the health of the system. It invests more people in the political process, and it disperses the source of funding where there's reasons for candidates to appeal to lots of people rather than a few big donors, who often are issue-based.
Yeah.
And kind of
We're moving in that direction since 2008 and Obama's campaign. There's much more small donor participation than there used to be.
That's a good
There's also this dark money. I mean, Musk spent $250 million in October.
That's where we have to close the spigot.
Yeah. Okay. My favorite is expanding the House.
Yes.
So talk about that for a second.
Right, and I think it's unbelievable how we have a House that has been the same number of members even as our population has expanded. And the result is districts are huge now. The point of districts wasn't to have many states that members of the House are representing.
Some of them are bigger than states.
Some are bigger than states. It's kind of unbelievable when you see the numbers. And so I think the arguments they've gained renewed interest in terms of expanding it are very important. It will allow members to have much kind of more and better quality communication with constituents. I think it will give constituents a better connection to the members. It can have all kinds of changes, including the kinds of money you need to raise. as opposed to today where you're trying to cover huge swaths of the country. And so I'm just very persuaded this is an important reform for the 21st
So if it was
century.
done, for much of American history, the number was expanded on a fairly consistent basis, regular basis, based on census. Then that stopped, went in the 30s or something, right? So if they did, if this reform was enacted, it would be about 150 new House members.
There's no set number, but it is, people say between 100 and 150.
Okay. All right. With that, we got a little time for questions. And
Okay, thank you. It's terrific. And I realize we could all listen to you for another hour or so, and I want to make sure everyone has a chance to get a book. So, quick question to get us rolling. Julian, I wonder if you see any threshold or limit to what the Republican Party will grant to the current president? Are there things that he probably can't do at risk of losing support? And I also wonder, you didn't say too much about recent changes in the Supreme Court. The presidents now play much more power, have more power than they had before, maybe less accountability, and I wonder if the kind of increased power of the presidency affects party dynamics in ways that we should be thinking about.
On the first one, there is something that would check, and it's very simple. What would lead the Republicans to respond is a threat to their own power. That is the logic of partisanship, is that when power is threatened, that's when you move. And when there are points of tension between President Trump and Republicans in the House and Senate, where they feel that what he is doing is a serious risk to their hold on power, that's when I think he could be in trouble, not for a revolt in mass, but a revolt in enough numbers that cause him a problem. And I do think that's what you saw with the initial spending freeze. And with the SCOTUS decisions, yes. I mean, I think it's become more intense. The presidential immunity was a really big decision, and I think, it doesn't totally change where we are. I mean, we do have an era where presidents are the head of the party. This just gives them much more muscle in that relationship, which gets back to part of what John says. And it'll allow presidents who want to deploy that power to be very, very forceful, not just in keeping everyone in line, but keeping them in line to do pretty dangerous things, because they're not fearful of being held accountable.
impunity, right? We're government by impunity, and you can be lawless because the Supreme Court lets you do it.
And it erodes, we've already seen an erosion or the weakness of the impeachment power under strong party conditions. It was almost irrelevant, and there was no way a Senate Republican body, even after insurrection, was going to act against the president. So you combine that with kind of court decisions, and that's part of the story we're talking about now.
Take some questions. Please raise your hand. Make sure wait for the mic to get to you.
Hi, I'm a grad student here at NYU. Populists generally have an anti-incumbent and anti-elite impulse in them, and they tend to bring the system down from within as well. And we talked about Steve Bannon and his shocking policy in terms of having that. But generally we have seen that departments and their heads and agencies and their heads tend to vie for influence and more institutional power, even at times to overreach as well. But now we are seeing a different trend. So is there a historical precedent where the heads of government or the heads of institutions and agencies tend to bring the system down from within the institutions and being the heads of those institutions? And secondly, do you see a contest or a contention between Silicon Valley and Trump, where Silicon Valley tends to be against government with no government so that they don't have any regulations, while Trump, on the other hand, wants a strong government, but that government should only be accountable to him instead of the institutions or the Constitution?
On the first, very good questions. The first question, there's a long history of it. So since the 1980s, this has been pretty central to a lot of Republican politics. Republican presidents, Reagan on, have had trouble actually cutting government. Until recently, every time they've directly gone after programs, there's often been so much blowback that they pull away. But one thing we saw starting in the 80s was essentially a strategy of staffing agencies and putting at the top of agencies people who don't want to actually enact the programs and administer the programs. So famously, Reagan has someone named James Watt as Secretary of Interior, and he had zero interest in doing what Interior was meant to do. He wanted to privatize land and kind of limit public land. Ann Gorsuch,
Yeah.
mother of the current Supreme Court Justice, was the head of the EPA, anti-environmental person running the program. Clarence Thomas was the head of Reagan's EEOC, and he said very openly he didn't favor affirmative action, wasn't going to do anything about the program. So this is a history, we've seen it, we saw it with George W. Bush, and it's very effective. You don't get rid of a program, but you weaken it. Question is now, are we in a period where they he just said, President Trump, this is a paraphrase, but that he wants essentially Linda McMahon as Secretary of Education to get rid of her own job. So if it goes right, but there's a long history to that strategy.
Let's just focus on that for 1 second, because there's a lot of concern about the Department of Education. That has to be done by statute, right? They need 60 votes to kill the Department of
Yes,
Education.
you can't
So
do it.
isn't that way down on the list of things we should worry about?
No, I mean, this gets back, it would be a court issue. And yes, it seems very clear cut, but USAID is, again, an early test case where we're seeing the president maneuver in ways people weren't totally expecting, folding it into the State Department. And even if he doesn't get rid of education, Secretary McMahon can do a lot of damage back to the point, even maintaining it. So there's two different parts. One is, we don't know, he is a stress test all the time, the president. So you are right, but then we wait to see, well, what happens if you try to do that? And we don't always know what happens. If you had asked in 2019 or early 2020, what happens if a president refuses to accept the results of an election and leads a whole effort to overturn it? It's known that he does it. It's not secret. It's not Watergate in the early times. Could he be elected? And the assumption was, like, of course not.
Of course not.
Okay, we're in the second term. So that was not the way to think of it. So we don't know, and this is a test of the institutions. But the other part, which gets to this question, you can still do immense damage. And I think they're aware of that. I think that the Project 2025 is advised, and it's not a secret. And I think that is what they're trying to do. I think Secretary Hegseth, as an example, is very intent on radically changing the Pentagon from the top, part cutting. And USAID, people are being put on leave, programs are being cut. That doesn't get rid of it, but you work from within.
So that's the test, and if he's not stopped now, it's like Hitler going to Poland. If he's not stopped now on AID from this unconstitutional behavior, it will whet his appetite to do it at EPA, education, all these other places.
Absolutely. And it is constitutional. I mean, it is not the gutting from within. It's not illegal, and that's a kind of political choice by the party.
Before we go to Silicon Valley, let's get a couple
Oh,
of
sorry.
questions. No, follow-up on Silicon Valley, because we have some other hands.
Thank you. Very quickly and related to the question of Professor King, it's about the powers of the president, because we live in a republic. We think that there's a democracy and there's separation of powers, but we're seeing that there's no balance of powers, that the president is getting more and more power, and it seems that it has no limit. So I wanted to ask you whether you think that there are going to be more increased powers because the Congress is Republican, the Supreme Court, and also there could be the chance that they could touch the Constitution and directly through the Congress. And my second point...
Let's just do one question.
Yes, sorry, yes.
Okay, let me answer that. And let me just say, Silicon Valley is a product of government investment. So they're not anti-government, they are literally on the foundation of generations of investment into research. On the second, yes, the answer is the president is more powerful than ever, but there are limits and Congress is not there. Congress has tons of power. They do have the power of the impeachment if they want to use it. They have the power over the budget if they want to use it. They can cut funds, they can redirect funds, they can vote against this reconciliation project. If Senate Republicans wanted to cause him problems, all the tools are there for the party to do that. So part of this is a choice. It's not simply a presidency that has become so powerful the other institutions are gone. Similar with SCOTUS, with the Supreme Court. That was a case they decided. They made a decision. No one had their hand on them. That was a deliberative decision that comes out of decades of legal thinking from the Federalist Society and kind of ideas of presidential power that they wanted to make. But the tools to push back are still there. It's a choice. It's a choice. And I don't think we should think of it as if that's all gone, because then that misses the opportunities available. And back to the book and to John's point, Democrats also have a choice to make. There are very legitimate partisan tools that a minority can use, which Republicans are great at. But without becoming what Republicans have done, meaning limiting themselves, that can cause problems for the administration, even appearing in public and kind of yelling and screaming is a tactic that legislators use. So there's lots of tools there. It's about whether they're used or not.
So my question would be, has there been any historical precedents or precedents in American history or world history that like sort of a libertarian movement could be combined with authoritarian impulses? And could you perhaps illustrate what those examples might be?
That's quite a combination, a libertarian, authoritarian, someone who believes in kind of individual freedom and then wants a very strong state.
It's called the Republican Party.
I mean, you can have coalitions with those impulses for sure, and some would argue both of those impulses, whether you call it authoritarianism or very strong-arm presidential decision making. I think there is some of that coalition. I do think there's a little bit of that with Elon Musk and parts of the GOP. To have both in one person doesn't really make sense to me, and I can't think of a precedent of someone who's combined it.
Maybe Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, maybe, but I don't think of him as a libertarian, because it's still an expansive form of presidential power that was introduced, and military power.
Well, my question is really relates to that, about the conflicts that you see going on between those competing for the country. I mean, I'd like to hear you both on the question of differences and the importance of the differences between what Steve Bannon is after and what Elon Musk is after. They do seem to be, in many ways, very much opposed.
Yeah. Well, just on H-1B visas, they're very vituperative on social media. They disagreed. Steve Bannon doesn't want any H-1B visas for skilled immigrants, and Musk knows that his company and the rest of tech needs these workers. So that's a potential area of conflict. I think the people who predict that Trump and Musk are going to fall out, I think are going to be proven wrong, because Trump had so much to do with Musk had so much to do with Trump's election, and Trump reveres him. So in the short term, Trump decided against Steve Bannon on this question. And you may recall that he fired Steve Bannon in 2017. So I think Bannon is going to get the short end of the stick on this particular one.
I think, look, there's differences in particular areas of policy for sure, including immigration. Bannon, if you hear him interviewed, often has very kind of nasty words to say about Silicon Valley's elite, including people working. There's an interview with him recently on one of the New York Times podcasts where he's just blasting people like Mark Andreessen and that kind of wealth. But there's also areas of agreement. I do think both Musk and him, Bannon, are on the same page in this idea of taking apart and really weakening the administrative power of government. Bannon was the one who said in 2016 the deconstruction of the administrative state, and you can look at Musk as he's actually moving that project along right now. And secondly, Bannon is a believer, as John said earlier, in the politics of attention, in the politics of chaos, really believes in that. And I think there's a little bit of Musk that believes in that too. And unlike Bannon, Musk has a platform that can do this incredibly effectively, meaning X. And so there are points of convergence, despite the tensions, where I think right now they're not totally on a different page. And together, if they can work in concert, that's a big threat to, again, the basis of what certainly Democrats have supported, which is a vibrant and effective government to handle the problems we face.
Yeah, and this is also not a new thing in the Republican Party. So my college classmate Grover Norquist, 30 years ago, said he wanted to make the federal government so small you could strangle it in a bathtub.
Okay, so we're a little tight on time. We have C-SPAN here. We have Julian ready to sign books. So what we're going to do is I see 3 hands and ask you to just go in sequence. We're going to ask quick questions, get pretty quick answers, so we can move on. So Glenn, I'm just right here first. And just stay there. We'll just move. We'll do the questions 1, 2, 3.
Thanks so much. My question is with regards to the claims or attempts of maybe territorial annexation, so thinking about Greenland, Canada, Gaza. How should we think about this as a return of American empire? How would you characterize it?
Great, thanks. Just pass it back.
Thank you both very much. If this question is discussed in your book, I'll defer. If it's not, I'm curious on your opinion on the sort of value of proportional representation and or top 2 or jungle primaries in reducing polarization, incentivizing more moderation in both parties.
Thank you.
If it's in the book.
Do you mind just passing the mic up here?
Yeah, please.
Just to the front row. Last question.
Thank you. Where do you see the future of multinational organizations, UN, IMF, NATO, like with regard to funding, or how do we withdraw from the US?
All right, so John, why don't you start with what you want, and then we'll give Julian the last word.
Okay, I don't think there's going to be a Gaza Riviera, and it's kind of a distraction from, a constitutional crisis that I think is already underway here. But this sovereigntist impulse, hyper-nationalism, expansionist, is something that will characterize his administration, and we're going to be dealing with it for the next 4 years. I'm very concerned about international organizations like the World Health Organization, because this is really hurting people. It's a bloated agency, but by pulling American funding, it's going to hurt and maybe even lead to the deaths of people around the world. I'm less worried about NATO because our allies have stepped up. Biden helped expand NATO, and I think NATO will survive whatever Trump throws at it.
I think on the it's not empire, it's kind of a different kind of territorial acquisition. I'm not sure a lot of it will happen. Maybe, I don't know with Panama, because it connects to China, which is focused on trying to take control. But it's not going to be easy, and it also contradicts stripping away the power of government, because that's what you need to actually control areas. So I don't know where it's going to go, and it's a kind of messier kind of expansionism than early 20th century imperialism. I talk about proportional representation, districting reform. Yeah. It's limited because it deals with the House. It doesn't explain the Senate. It doesn't explain presidential politics. And again, I'm not against partisanship, but I'm not against those reforms because it can temper some of the partisanship and create the kind of politics I'm talking about. But it's limited in what we'll achieve. It's not even clear when you do that, you eliminate in those districts very strong partisan impulses, which map out with the geography. But I think they're worth looking at, and some of the redistricting stuff has been effective. And finally, yeah, I'm worried about that. I mean, I'm worried. I think the institutions are strong, but they're certainly not as strong as they were 10, 20 years ago. And I think if the United States really pulls away from some of these different, the economic ones and the military ones, that's a big partner. And I don't know in the long run if just a kind of European coalition can sustain the costs in Berlin. So it's something to watch.
I'd like to have you both back here in 4 years to see where this debate stands. But for now, Jonathan Alter and Julian Zelizer, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.